some notes to start with, and then I'll just talk to the slides. And I'll most likely ramble, so Rebecca, wherever she's gone, will put her hand up when I've got about 5 minutes to spare. There's no doubt that the street is a complex place, both spatially and socially. And there are often competing and conflicting demands which must be catered for. And while this can present a challenge for designers, people like us, and for managers of streets, and I know there are a lot of people here from the council today, it's that mix of activities and those conflicting demands of users that we think as designers bring out the best opportunities. Those overlaps and those clashes sometimes are where the richness of design can be, that's what we can mine for richness in design. So we're particularly interested on what happens in the street, and that's why I was particularly taken by the introductory presentation. And when we're designing a street, we're not just thinking conceptually about what should happen on a street, but we're really asking ourselves, what happens on that street that we're being asked to design? Streets have personalities, and quite often they have niche markets. We can all think of streets that are known for particular things. You know, Brunswick Street in Melbourne, or Chapel Street, and we all know international streets. Sometimes before we've even been to that city, we know that street, what it looks like, what it's known for. It's got a personality. So streets are places as well as links on a hierarchy, a road hierarchy. So as a landscape practice, streetscape projects do make up quite a significant proportion of our portfolio and the work that occupies us. But so we're all here today, a lot of us are landscape architects because we're interested in streets from that aspect as designers. But why should our cities' leadership groups and decision makers be interested in streets? Well, I think our cities' leaders should be interested in streets because of global competitiveness. There's no doubt that cities compete with each other for market shares of, for population to drive economies. Global competitiveness and economic performance relies more than ever on the attractiveness and livability of our streets. Charles Landry, who is a consultant to many cities across the world, specifically on their competitiveness in a global market, tells us that 18 years ago, 80% of people located or chose the city that they would live in based on where they could find a job. Today, 64% of the population chooses a city before they find that job. I think that's really significant. Because if you think about how much space the streets take up in a city, so how much of that city that people are choosing is based on streets. Established practice in the development industry when I work on a new community or an infill site is about 30% of the land goes over to public realm. And of course, part of that is public open space, not streets. But there's a significant proportion of that 30%, maybe half, maybe more, often more, that is actually streetscape. So there's a large portion of the cities that people are choosing that are just streets. So they're really, really important for the livability of a city. Streets and how they function, how vibrant they are, contribute to the livability of our cities and also to the health of our communities. But there's also another level of competition, I think, happening for streets. I'll show you later some images of our work at Rundle Mall, which is a pedestrianised shopping environment. On that project, which really needed a revitalisation, we quickly realised that we're not competing just with other streets in Adelaide, but we're almost competing with the virtual street. It's much easier to compare prices and do your shopping and even get a lot of your services now on the virtual street, on the internet. So the actual physical street in the case of Rundle Mall, has to offer something that the virtual street doesn't. And that's got to be about face-to-face contact with people. It's got to be about community. It's got to be about the physical aspects of the community. So the next slide just shows, well, therefore, if that's what streets could be about and should be about, then surely the most important people, the people we have, the most important users of streets are people, and that's who we have to design streets for. Not rocket science, I'm sure, I know I'm not the first person to say it, but it's certainly what drives our practice and the way we approach streetscape projects. So we've assembled a collection of projects ranging from minimum to maximum intervention in the streetscape, the existing site, and we've through the examples of the projects, I'm going to just explore what happens in the street and where that happens. So I'm going to be talking about projects that are temporary and experimental, so they're just on existing streets, we're not affecting the street, we haven't affected the street fabric, to what I've called multi-mode but traditional, and by that I mean splitting modes, multi-mode shared, pedestrianised environments, and then new streets, old typologies. So a precinct in Melbourne, where in fact McGregor, Coxwell and HASSELL collaborated on, which was introducing completely new streets in an existing site, undeveloped site. So in terms of temporary and experimental projects, there's lots of interesting pop-up projects happening all over the place, all over the world at the moment, but I think that they're particularly significant because they're a way that we can test ideas. That's what interests me about pop-up and temporary and experimental projects. If you have a look at this timeline, we often try and convince our clients that those temporary projects should in fact be part of the overall permanent project, and we've mapped it against the timeline of a project to show how those temporary projects really, you can think about them as quick wins, ways that you engender support and get people to buy into the ultimate project. One of the projects that that falls into this temporary category is the Walk the Line Streetscape competition that we participated in and won last year. The idea of this project was simply to link, it was run by the New South Wales chapter of AILA, and they presented 5 different sites, and you could insert a temporary use in that or a temporary proposal in the project in any of the sites. What we did was we linked all 5 sites, basically with very little material, very small intervention. It was basically a pathway marked by a series of pink dots, but it was punctuated at each of the sites with opportunities for play, going back to the idea of what used to happen in streets. And of course we're talking about city streets here, very different to a residential community. So it was also a bit of fun, but it was pointed in a way, trying to get people to think about what used to happen on the streets before the age of the iPod. And obviously lots of fun, Foursquare, this, an opportunity to piff your rubbish into the bin from the gold circle. So that was one very, very low intervention project. We basically stuck stickers on the ground and then scraped them up again after the project was over. We've also recently considered the Urban Coffee Farm as part of the Melbourne Food and Wine Festival. This was a much larger proposition. It went for 17 days. The site is, you can see the little red dot, approximately the middle of the site there. Queensbridge Square in Melbourne, on South Bank Boulevard, just where the Sandridge Bridge hits the square there. Although it's called a square, it doesn't really have much of a life of its own. It's kind of ill-defined. It is at the end of that pedestrian link on the bridge, but it's a pretty lifeless square. You can see the yellow handrail coming down off the bridge, and there is a very large kind of lightweight stair structure, the red structure, over a car park entry. The interesting thing about this place is that those grey arrows represent footfall of 50,000 people a day walk through that space. And I'd suggest that very, very few of those people stop. So this was about working with the Melbourne Food and Wine, who had a theme about coffee. They wanted us to come up with a temporary cafe. And we went and spoke with providers of coffee, Ben from Five Senses sources, ethically sources coffee from Guatemala, and we learned a lot about coffee and thought, in fact, that's what this space should be about. So as well as play, we thought that public spaces and street spaces can also be about learning. What we hoped to do via the coffee farm was to help people understand where in fact their coffee comes from. So people are really interested in provenance and where the food mile is involved in producing food. So there was an opportunity to create a farm with an education zone and a tasting area. But also to draw people's attention to the enormous amount of logistics that it takes to actually move the beans to Melbourne, roast them, grind them before you get your latte. The concept of the idea of using crates and containers has been done a million times, but for us it was an important way just to draw that connection with the logistics. So here's the concept. The idea was about bringing a little bit of the jungle, that still somewhat mysterious place that your coffee comes from, to the city, and using the red stair to evoke the terrain of the terraced coffee farm, and bringing it to Melbourne, so you can see literally what the connection we're making. And we talked about the image of the right being a takeaway jungle. Our young designers workshopped a number of ideas and then developed this one that we went forward with, and that was the original concept: how we could use the materials involved in the logistics of moving coffee around the world to actually create a terrain and occupy that red stair. And went through all the process of sourcing the pallets and building up the concept. I'll scoot through. And sourcing some established coffee trees from a farm in Queensland that had actually gone out of business, and getting some contributions from Warner's Nursery and other partners, and it was a really successful installation for the duration of the festival. You can see we very cleverly borrowed the landscape of the plane trees behind, but we think we really managed to evoke that. And coffee trees always grow under a protective understory, and we really wanted to evoke that kind of hillside. So that space, talking about learning, that space in the back there was usually full of people tasting different coffees, brewed in different ways, roasted in different ways. So it was quite a learning environment. It was a lot of fun. We got a lot of media coverage and a lot of blogging happened from there. Interestingly, the program over 17 days featured, because it was part of the Melbourne Food and Wine Festival, featured some fantastic Melbourne cafes and restaurants. But we thought this was a really good way of getting the community involved. So projects like this they're often criticised, I think, because the permanent cafe owners are concerned about trade taken away from them. But this is a way that existing businesses can be showcased. Chasing Kitsune was another temporary project that we worked on. Kitsune is a mythical Japanese fox, and no one knows where he's going to be tomorrow. No one knows where he was last night and where he's going to be tomorrow. It moved. This project moved around the city, and the only way you could find out where it was is by following on Twitter or Facebook. So you only ever found out a couple of hours beforehand where it was going to be. The experimental part of this project was this movable landscape that in each different location looked different, because it had to be configured in different ways because of the environment. So that was another really interesting temporary project. I'll play it in here. Yeah, so if we move on from the temporary and move on to projects that perhaps we permanent projects. This category talks about multi-mode, and by traditional, as I said before, I'm talking about splitting, not shared streets. And the example we're using is the Afghan Bazaar Streetscape Design Project. The project is in Dandenong, which is to Melbourne's, it's an eastern suburb of Melbourne. It's an employment centre, but a centre that's been in decline for quite some time. There's Thomas Street there. Places Victoria ran a project over some years revitalising Dandenong, and there was a lot of good work that came out of that. Lonsdale Street upgrade and some master plans for various precincts. The idea for the Afghan Bazaar came out of that work. There was some signage done. The Thomas Street was identified as the centre of the Afghan community. In fact, I think it's 40% of Victoria's Afghan community, I think Australia's Afghan community lives in Dandenong. And this LGA is certainly represents the highest proportion of Afghani people. So the project the first project that came out of Places Victoria's work here was a signage project marking this as the Afghan Bazaar. And unfortunately, they got it wrong because camels were used as symbols on the project. And for anyone that knows anything about the Afghan community, the camel is a very clear representation of the Pashtuns, who dominate the other communities or sub-communities, and it was a very, very contentious thing to do. It upset a lot of people. Now, as a response to that, Sinatra Murphy were asked to conduct a really detailed community consultation project, and they did a wonderful job. We were engaged then to deliver a design that, rather than focusing on those differences between the subsets of the community, focus on what they had in common. And you'll see in some of the images what they were. It's just a really simple cross-section through a typical street with footpaths separated from the carriageway with parking zones, and we reduced the number of parking, but I'll go through that. So the project provided a focus for the precinct. You can see in the sketch design, and that was to mark, do what the signage with the camels was trying to do, mark that entry into the precinct, but provide a visual focus. Thinking about what the subsets of the community had in common, there was a lot of talk about the importance of the blue mosque in Afghanistan, the colour blue itself, red and blue from Afghani rugs, the idea of creating meeting places, and meeting places that were particularly good for large groups, family groups, and after dark. So there's a very large part of community activity in the Afghani community that happens after dark. Family groups go out as an outing, and they sit in groups in the street. That's how those streets are used in Afghanistan and all throughout the Middle East. And that's how the community wanted to keep using it. So we've gone through play and learning, and now we're kind of up to talking about meeting and family groups meeting and occupying the street. The water access was also a very important component, but we picked that up in using the blue as a theme, a colour theme throughout the project. You can see all sorts of references in the Middle Eastern use of blue. Another consistent theme was in the art, and in particular religious motifs, the use of Islamic patterning, which we reinterpreted and reapplied in different ways in the furniture and in the paving through the project. So some of these slides are sort of reference images, and they show how we built up the ideas. One of the ideas that we explored was the idea of a sofa as a seating module in direct response to how that community occupies space traditionally. So we reinterpreted that and redesigned it again using the motif of the Islamic geometries and applying it to a new piece of furniture. And this slide here shows on the top left just a detail of how we resolved some of the focal point and introduced at some locations quite a detailed patterning of paving that really evoked the traditional carpets and treatment of floors in Islamic tradition. I'll go back because one point I didn't make was that treatment isn't consistent. Sorry, we'll skip back. The treatment isn't consistent because the point we're trying to make is that we enlarged the footpath as much as we could, but rather than treating it the same way all along, really provided focal points and meeting places. So you can see that diagonal kind of setup that we've set up for that visual connection between those meeting places. The trees, I don't have a slide on the trees, but the trees we used are also species that grow in Afghanistan, Amelia, and other species. The tree species was in Iraq. We also worked with a local Afghani artist who has done some wonderful things around Melbourne. He's made a beautiful Afghani tea bicycle that goes around Dandenong and other festivals, other places in Melbourne during festivals. But he worked on this lighting feature which incorporates a lot of the Islamic geometries and also the mosaic tiles that you can see in the base. So that's a light totem that he worked on independently. Oh, well, with us, sorry. And a visualisation of that corner, you can just see the light, the lantern incorporated in that focal point. So the kind of activities we're talking about in that project, to answer the questions of what happens on the street, is not foreign to what the general Australian community does on the street, but the resolution of the detail is quite specific to the community that we were designing for. Very successful project. All those Afghani traders signed up for a reduction in car parking, which is always the challenge on these streetscape projects. It's very difficult to convince people that they do want enlarged footpaths and street trees and are going to have to give something up spatially, and it's very difficult to convince people, shopkeepers in particular, to give up car parking spot in front of their shop. But we had great success with that one. In Adelaide, Hindley Street, you can see the highlighted area that we're working at there. The project in this case is a shared street, so we were able to negotiate all the red tape in Adelaide and come up with a portion of shared street. Now, just to get the orientation, to the top of the page, that top road is North Terrace. You can just see the construction of the new hospital going in, and Rundle Mall in the city centre is kind of to the right, and this is the Uni SA, the City West campus. There's a lot of cross-movement across Hindley Street, and an enormous increase in that movement predicted pedestrians coming from the hospital and also from the new stadium. So we had to sort of deal with the projected increase in pedestrian traffic in a safe way. So, as a simple diagram, this is what exists right now. The street is dominated by vehicles, and you've got narrow footpaths to the side. And our idea was pretty simple: just remove the curbs and barriers and create a single shared surface from building to building, so that rather than feeling like and reading like a link, that zone there starts to feel like a place. And we're trying to, at the starting point, link it with materials so that it just looks like the one place. The other things we did in terms of safety was to reduce pedestrian crossing distance, to encourage low speed car environment, to improve the pedestrian and road user legibility, and of particular importance, obviously, when you've got a shared street. You have to give signals to the drivers that they're entering a shared street environment and really their speed needs to be slower. And encourage greater on-street activation and precinct management. So that last one kind of went beyond the physical part of our project and really starts to step into the management and the involvement of that community on the ongoing success of the street. So this is the section as it exists now, pretty simple, pretty typical. And our proposed section captured in this diagram here. You can see the sort of up and down of all the grading. Of course, we wanted a much simpler solution, but there was challenges with maintaining cover on existing services that couldn't be moved. All those challenges of working in an urban environment. And if you look really closely, that central drain on the footpath is in fact not central, and it's not exactly the same as the other side, but it was all just trying to move around all the constraints that we had going on underneath the ground. Which led us to the completed design, which shows another first for, well, not another first, but a first for Adelaide, some zebra crossings, which are normal in Melbourne, but they don't occur in Adelaide. Do you have them in Hobart? No. Well, now Adelaide's got them too, as a result of this project, and we went through a very rigorous and time-consuming negotiation with the Department of Transport and Infrastructure in Adelaide, who were partners on this project and supported this solution. And even got away with not having the flashing yellow lights at the zebra crossings as well. And the way we've managed to do that is by having some very carefully designed, what we've called kind of orientation zones at both ends, where the vehicles are squeezed into the centre of the road. A median is introduced as a visual cue, and bikes and vehicles have to use that same carriageway at those orientation zones. So we've got bike lanes ending and merging with traffic, with the bikes taking precedence over the vehicles, and that will be handled purely by signage, but also by changing materials on the road surface to slow vehicles down, etc. So that condition exists in that shared zone in the middle. So if I was a student here, I'd just be able to or a pedestrian, I should say, I'd be able to cross that central sort of beige zone wherever I wanted, and I'd take priority as a pedestrian. So some before and after shots. This project is not in construction. You can see there a new building, university building. That's a HASSELL and John Wardle project. But this is the proposed view from that same place. So we're extending that paving and really connecting it across the entire zone from building to building. So another project example in Adelaide, this time a completely pedestrianised environment. Rundle Mall, I mentioned it before. It was pretty important to Adelaide, has been the premier shopping space for a very long time and is in decline and suffering from very stiff competition from shopping centres located on the outskirts of town. If you know Adelaide, again, that road to the top is North Terrace. Yeah, so that's one of the that's the newspaper, the front page of the newspaper on the day before the Rundle Mall was commissioned in 1976. Apparently the first mall in Australia, pedestrianised mall in Australia, although I have worked, and I will show you, Nicholson Street Mall in Footscray in Melbourne, who also claimed to be the first pedestrianised mall in Australia, so I'm not quite sure which one was actually first. I think there's 2 years between them. Originally, Rundle Mall was a functioning, fully trafficked street with trams running down the centre. In 1976, it was commissioned as a mall, and in 2011, or today really, because construction's barely started, it was pretty jam-packed with a whole lot of insertions that had been overlaid over quite some time. So there were central light poles and central restaurants in not particularly good condition, and a lot of movable planters, etc. A mishmash of materials. Our concept was to, that's the existing, that's a zooming of the existing. Our concept was to reveal the good stuff that is in Rundle Mall. So the first move was really to convince the client that they had to remove quite a bit. Had to remove those central restaurants blocking views along the mall, had to remove the central lighting. And there's quite a number of fantastic buildings along the mall that we wanted to draw attention to with lighting, but also just removing some paraphernalia in front of it. Just reveal what you've actually got to start with as the first step. And then enable a whole lot of things to happen in the mall, but not prescribe them. So we decided that people should, well, we intend for people to walk up against the shop fronts themselves, but mainly in the centre. So it becomes a space that is about people, and we've described those pink zones that in the diagram are what we call the enabling zones. That's where you can sit, that's where you can, we've got some plug and play, or what we're calling plug and play temporary uses. There's power and water at various locations, and different carts and temporary uses can be brought in. So we've really narrowed down those enabling zones. That's where you'll find all the bins, bike racks, trees, seats, etc. Sure. And really thought about how to extend the attractiveness of the mall into the night time. It's a very popular place during the daytime, but very, very little activity during the night. So we've been working with the Rundle Mall Traders Association to make that happen as well. Simple things like extending some trading hours, and that's already started to happen. And I'd say that's one of the most important things to get management of those spaces in place to guarantee ongoing success of projects. This diagram shows the location of those, what we call plug and play, simply power and water provided to those temporary uses, and detail quite a rich, non-directional kind of design. It's not. It really just is a textured floor, ground plane that implies intensity of uses. So you can see those platforms. That platform at the intersection of King William, it's a gathering place, and the clusters of trees and clusters of seating, and that's reinforced by the intensification of paving underneath it. I won't dwell on that. Details of the furniture. So we've got a small amount of time left. Oops. There's an example of, there's an image of one of the restaurants at the end, and our before and after shots. I won't spend too much time on this one. This is another pedestrianised mall example. This time in Melbourne, Nicholson Street Mall example. It was a great finished product. The problem with this project was that ongoing management of the space just didn't support the vibrancy of the environment, and we learned a lot out of that project. finished product was a good one, but what really matters is what people are doing in the street, so activities. So I put that in as a bit of a, that's a project that we learnt a lot on and wasn't our most successful. But the last category, and then I'll wrap up, was thinking about new streets in completely new precincts or new communities. But the title I've used is New Streets, Old Typologies. Batman Hill was a project, a competition. In fact, we worked with Mark and the rest of the team at McGregor Coxall in Melbourne. That's the site there, this time in red. It's on the western side of the western edge of the expanding CBD, and it really links the traditional CBD with the Docklands area. Well, it's one of the sites that does so. Our idea was to recreate the topography of Batman Hill, and some of those reference images are collected on this page. You can see that in the top, cut into that with some pedestrian axes, but use the typology of the Melbourne laneway as the streetscape reference, I suppose, into the precinct. You can see on the bottom left the idea of the original grid sort of just being draped over the topography, I should say, and that's the idea. Yeah, that's the idea that we applied to the site. This actually shows Collins Street, so the edge of Collins Street was treated quite differently to the internal streets. I won't dwell on that because I've only got a couple of minutes. But here's a study of the various laneways within Melbourne, really studied their width and height and why they work spatially, and applied those, you can see at the top, to the site. These diagrams very quickly show existing pedestrian movement on the left, skirting past the site, and the proposed pedestrian laneways through, mimicked by the bike connection at the bottom right. So we're cutting into that site from the perimeter streets with laneways that are pedestrianised. And you can see here in the top right how we're dragging in some surrounding public open space or green space into the site as well, and connecting with public transport. Very quickly, Rebecca, the actual ground, the plan of the site is something like this, showing Batman Walk identified there. That is the main pedestrian street through, terminating at a square on Collins Street. The rest of the spaces were really laneways that had smaller local plazas hanging off them. Using the established Melbourne palette of materials, but in a different configuration, and creating very intimate pedestrian streets within this large commercial, mixed-use and civic project. And I could talk for another 45 minutes on this project alone, but I won't. Not today. Anyway.